Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. We're going to do a series, short episodes, I'm going to try to make them, which are all connected to explain the statement by Bishop Ambrose in the mid 300s, maybe late 300s, saying that the 12 in 1 Corinthians 9:2, Paul is saying that the 12 had determined he was a false apostle. That was what was behind Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2. But we're going to ask, why did this happen? We've before shown you the language and what's involved. I'll show you again here. This is the actual text. You can find this in the Patrologiae and as well in the CSEL. And you'll see that it says, Apostolos esse negabator. He was denied to be an apostle. So he's going to explain that. And what we showed you is both Latin texts have these 6 words here, both of them, both the Patrologiae and the CSEL. But for some reason, when this was translated recently, this did not include, by Mr. in Bray's edition of the translation of Ambrose's works, these words are the only words omitted. I want to make clear again that I was trained in a top high school in New York, a prep school, on translating Latin, and I received a scholarship for it. So I think I know how to do it, but it doesn't matter. Anybody can verify what I'm saying who knows Latin. And so what we have here is propter Scandalon ab hoc re dismantlibus, okay? And what that means is because of either an offense, that's one meaning of the word scandalum, or, in this case, more likely, a stumbling block. That means Paul had caused others to sin by something he did. Let's assume it's eating meat sacrificed to idols just for the moment, because that's where we're going. I just want to make that clear. And this led the apostles, okay, that's just an understanding of who it was upset with him, to withdraw themselves from him. So then he withdraws himself from them. Okay, so what we have here is statements that should have been translated but weren't. And I'll leave that away to my prior episodes. There are question marks why that would ever be not translated, but that's where it is. Now, if you have any doubt, this is what the word said. This is the screenshot from CSEL 81.2, page 97, and you'll see all the words over here on the right are all over here on the left. Just screenshot it and you can verify. So we're going to read this in a second. I just want to show you what prompted this whole investigation. Is I was reading this work. Gerald Bray edited it. It's called Ancient Christian Commentary on Scriptures, and I think it's volume 7, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and it's a translation of the works of Ambrose. And this is what Ambrose says at 9:2, according to Bray's edition. An apostle to the Corinthians, Ambrose says, those Jewish believers who nevertheless continued to observe the law of Moses denied that Paul was an apostle, because he taught that it was no longer necessary to be circumcised and to observe the Sabbath. And this is what I'm trying to say, is that is an incomplete statement by this gentleman, Ambrose, because it's really clearly about eating meat sacrificed to idols, as we'll see. That's another third thing, potentially. Even the other apostles thought that he was teaching something different because of this, and they denied that he was an apostle. So the other 12 believed that these doctrines that he was teaching about Sabbath, that it was done away with. And I'm not sure what he means about circumcision. That's what I'm dispute, is that's not what Paul is talking about in Galatians 2. He says the party of circumcision was teaching Peter not to eat at the table with the Gentiles, but that didn't have to do with circumcision. That had to do with the eating meat sacrificed to idols, potentially. So better to not sit with them when you can't be sure what they're going to give you is idol meat, basically. Let's keep reading. Even the other apostles thought that he was teaching something different because of this, and they denied that he was an apostle. But to the Corinthians, Paul was an apostle because he had seen the signs of God's power in him. That's his complete translation. And he cited the wrong edition. It's 81.2, page 97. Okay, so now let's go back. Let's see what my translation would be. Okay, so I'm going to read my translation. Although I am not an apostle to others, yet I am to you. That's the verse. Now, that's what Ambrose is going to explain. Why does Paul say that? Because of the Jews who believed and who nevertheless kept the law, he was denied to be an apostle. For he was already teaching that neither the law of circumcision should be observed, nor should the Sabbath be kept. But to the rest of the apostles, meaning the 12, because of an offense by Paul, or stumbling block, that's another meaning of scandalon here, from Paul, causing that is to cause others to sin, led the apostles to withdraw themselves from him, Paul, due to the fact he seemed to be teaching differently from them. Therefore, the apostle Paul was denied by them, that is, the other apostles. But to these, the Corinthians, he was an apostle, for from him they had seen signs of virtue. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord, says Paul. For by preaching this, they were converted from idols to the faith of the one God. And what, again, I'm just going to repeat it, is this is definitely mistranslated. I mean, not even translated at all. This section in here is not translated in this passage by Mr. In the Bray edition of the translation of Ambrose. Okay, where is that at all? It's gone, and it's the most important part of the passage. Why was there scandalum? Meaning there was either an offense or a snare set. And what was that snare or offense? I'm going to give you now a heads up on the next episode, where we're going to go look at Galatians 2:11 in the commentary by Ambrose, and you're going to see some interesting facts that the apostles seem to differ among themselves. Okay, that's what it says in my translation. Mr. Bray's edition says, which caused the apostles to fall out with each other, another. So either way, it's not good. Okay, and what was going on in Galatians 2:11 is obviously the cause of what we're reading in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2. So we'll get to that in the next episode after this one. Now, why am I starting with the issue of meat sacrifice idols? Because that's where everything is pointing to Galatians 2, verse 11, where Paul dresses down Peter and says, "You're a hypocrite, Peter. You stand condemned. I withstood him to his face." All these things are there in the commentary here, and yet you'll see those are also modified. Let's put it that way. Let's look at Exodus 34, verses 12 to 15. This is about eating meat sacrificed to idols. "Take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land wherever you go, lest it be for a snare." In other words, this not following the rules here, getting rid of the altars and the sacrifices of the Gentiles completely in the land of Israel. Without doing that, you will be ensnared. And so the danger of not taking care of this properly will ensnare you, and that's a serious sin, as you'll see, in the midst of thee. "But you shall break down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars, and you shall cut down their asherim, for thou shalt worship no other God. For Yahweh, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they play the harlot after their gods, and sacrifice unto their gods, and one call you, and you eat of his sacrifice." So that's talking about, you might not even know, because if you allow these temples to exist, you could be eating meat sacrificed to idols unaware, and that is to your great disservice. And so to prevent that, you have to now get rid of the temples of the pagans in your community. And what would be the alternative if you actually live in the pagan land, like when Peter is visiting Galatia? If you're aware they're not just eating vegetables, you would withdraw from eating with them. Just common sense. It has nothing to do with anything Paul's teaching about circumcision or Sabbath, which is thrown out here by Ambrose as a possibility. The real answer is, it's only this. It's a snare, eating meat sacrificed to idols. Paul definitely defends that in 1 Corinthians 8 and 1 Corinthians 10, which we'll show you in a minute. I'm going to digress just a little bit to show you something that you might not be aware of, that the word scandal or whatever, it actually comes from a word that didn't mean scandal in the sense of a shocking accusation. No, it was a piece of wood. See the wood over here of young Michael from my Costa Rican visits? He was catching birds using corn seed, and he would hold a string around the bottom of this little piece of wood, and when the birds would wander in to eat, he could catch a bird, not to eat, but just to enjoy in his home. And this is a picture of what it would be. You use a box trap to catch a bird, or a more strong animal, maybe I don't want to say, but could be, I don't want to say a bear. It would have to be something small. But anyway, you could catch small animals this way. And you just put a trap for them with the Scandalon waiting for them, and you pull the string, and they're ensnared. And that's what this means here. Propter scandalum ab ac re dismantlus. Because of an offense, that's one idea, or more likely, a stumbling block from Paul, i.e. causing others to sin, led the apostles to withdraw themselves from him, Paul. So that was an important removal. And now let's just read the whole context so you can see this is a very serious these 6 words that were removed materially altered what you would perceive is what's going on. Let's take a look. Okay, and now I want to show you what how Jesus used the word scandalon, or its verb tense. Uh, Matthew 13, verse 41. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of the kingdom all that cause stumbling and being ensnared, scandalon, and them that do iniquity, and shall cast them into the furnace of fire. So scandalon is salvific. If you teach a scandalon, this is a big deal. Revelation 2, verse 14, and it's kind of the same word is going to be used about here by Jesus about meat sacrificed idols. At Pergamum, some among you hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block, a what? A snare, scandalon before the children of Israel to eat things sacrificed to idols. So that's what Balaam did, and that's why Jesus is condemning him in Revelation 2. Now, I just want to show you in Latin as well as in Greek, the words have an overlapping commonality, but in Greek it's actually narrower, meaning the stumbling block, the snare. So let me just read you the definition of the word. So the Latin word scandalum, which means stumbling block or offense. So it could be a sin itself or something that people get ensnared of that you are teaching. But now let's go to the Greek. The scandalon means there that it refers to either a stumbling block. Oops, it's only stumbling block in the Bible, a behavior or attitude that leads another to sin. So there's your problem. Paul's teaching you can eat sacrifice idols in 1 Corinthians 8 and 1 Corinthians 10. Big problem. Now I just want to show you that if Paul were permitting the Gentiles to eat meat sacrificed idols, he's going against the ruling in Acts 15 by the church, his superiors. These are the 12, and James, the Davidic heir, as I pointed out in a recent episode. That's why he has all this authority. He's the next in line when Yeshua is up in heaven. Who's the ruling authority? If the Romans went away, who was ruling the country? It would be James, the next in line. But anyway, let's read what it said here. This is James, the ruling authority, and basically the Davidic heir while Jesus is in heaven. This is called a suzerain position. He rules in his stead until he returns. Acts 15:20. But that we write unto them that they abstain, that is, do not eat, from the pollutions of idols. Now remember that word, pollutions of idols, and from what is strangled, and from blood. Acts 15:29. That you abstain from things sacrificed to idols, which if you keep yourselves, it shall be well with you. Acts 21, verse 25. But as touching the Gentiles, I'm going to pause here. James in Acts 21, verse 21 says, Paul, we've heard rumors that you're guilty of apostasia. That's the Greek word. Just go look at Mr. Mounsey's reverse interlinear to see the word. We've heard you're guilty of apostasy. That means he's guilty, allegedly, of having violated Deuteronomy 13:1-10, a death penalty under the law that if you teach against obeying God's word, God's law, you have to be executed. But Paul was a Roman citizen. They probably couldn't do that. But anyway, Acts 21, verse 25. But as touching the Gentiles that have believed, we wrote, giving judgment that they should keep themselves from things sacrificed to idols, and from eating meat with blood, and from eating what is strangled. All right, I read you already Jesus' words about Pergamum. That was told you're not supposed to eat meat sacrificed to idols. Again, Book of Revelation is a couple of years after Paul's already passed on. And we're going to read again a second time. Jesus condemns what Paul's teaching. You'll see it in a second. Revelation 2:20. Notwithstanding, I, Jesus, have a few things against you, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel. This is addressing one of the churches in Asia Minor. By the way, this means a group of people are Greeks, Greek speakers. They're from pagan or Gentile background, which calls herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. Is Jesus against eating meat sacrificed to idols? Yes. Let's take a look here. What does Paul say? I'm just going to read 1 Corinthians 8. If you want, just go take a look at 1 Corinthians 10. Paul on eating meat sacrificed to idols. As concerning, therefore, the eating of those things that are offered and sacrificed unto idols, which we know that an idol is nothing in the world. Now, by the way, did God say to the people, don't worry about this, we know an idol's nothing, you can go ahead and eat it in the Exodus passage? No. So this is contradicting God's word. And what is apostasy? Anyone who teaches you not to follow God's word, such as in Exodus, that's apostasy, subject to a death penalty in Deuteronomy 13:1-10. Anyone who turns you away, even if they have signs and wonders, God says, even if they have a prophecy that comes to pass, you must reject them, because this is a test, whether you love me, Yahweh, with all your heart, mind, and soul. All right, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is none other than God but one, but meat commends us not to God. Well, God sees it completely different than Paul. I just showed you in Exodus. For neither if we eat are we the better. Yeah, that's much, much better, rather than being subjected to the demonic influences of the meat sacrificed idols, Paul. Neither if we eat not are we the worse. You are, if you eat not, you are better. you're in a better position. But he hasn't reversed it. He's just completely reversing God's word in Exodus, right? But take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours becomes a stumbling block. There, he understands snares to them that are weak. So now he's only concerned that, well, we have this freedom. Don't let it be a stumbling block to those, a snare to those who think it's wrong. Okay, but you know they're not. You know it's unnecessary to be concerned. That's what Paul's saying. For if any man sees that you, which have knowledge, sit at meat in the idol's temple. This is one of the oddest things he ever said. So if somebody sees you at the temple, idol's temple, and then he's going to explain, when you should refrain from eating the meat there or not, it's like sick. What is he doing at the idol's temple in the first place? But I digress. For if any man see they which has knowledge sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak conscience is one who wants to follow Exodus, or follow Jesus, but he didn't even know about Jesus' words that were going to crush him. And 2 years later, which is weak, be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols. And through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died. But when you sin so against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. So he's saying, don't do it if somebody thinks it's wrong. If you see you eating at the temple, they might get the idea that you're encouraging them to do something sinful. So if they're around, just don't eat when you see these people who are weak-minded people. I mean, by the way, he's insulting a whole class of people who are following God's word, following Jesus' words, for sure. Okay, so it's unbelievable. This is 1 Corinthians 8, verses 4 to 12, KJV. Now, why did Peter not eat at the table with the Gentiles in the epistle to the Galatians? That's what Paul said. And then Paul said that Peter's decision to not do so was hypocritical because before the people from James' party, meaning the Bishop of James, the Davidic heir, Jesus was the Davidic heir, but he ascended into heaven. So now the person in charge to be king of Israel, if there was a overthrow of the Romans, was James, the Bishop of Jerusalem. So he is saying Peter is not eating and not acting rightly and is acting hypocritically. He only does things because of what people can see. And I find that very ironic because that's what Paul actually advocates, that very attitude in 1 Corinthians 9. I'll act as a Jew when I'm around a Jew. I'll act as a Gentile when I'm around a Gentile. So, I'll be all things to all men so that I may please some and therefore advance the gospel. So he just seems to talk out of both sides of his mouth in this instance. But let's look at it this way. The answer to this question, why did Peter not eat at the table of Gentiles, is because the prophet Daniel had already set an example of not eating at the same table with those eating meat sacrificed to idols as a means to comply with Exodus 34, verses 12 to 15. Let's take a look at that. This is an article by Efron J., 1987, Studies on the Hasmonean Period, Leiden 96-104. The article is entitled Food in Daniel 1, verses 5 to 16, the first report of a controlled experiment. And it's written by Susan Weingarten, formerly Department of Classical Archaeology, Tel Aviv University. And this is important. She's going to tell you something of how the Jewish people regarded eating meat sacrificed to idols. It's not something that, it just goes away because an idol is it's just a piece of wood. Of course it is. But the spiritual realm is invoked to bless over the meat. And the meat is contaminated or defiled, not the idol. Let's continue. Gentile food had become suspect of being connected to pagan rituals, so it was considered preferable to suffer martyrdom rather than eat it. Efron 1987. That's pretty amazing. Daniel understood salvation was at risk if he ate that meat, and that's why he bargained with the servant of the king of Babylon to not have to eat that and eat vegetables and beans and lentils. If you look more carefully at Exodus 34, verses 12 to 15, you'll see that God is telling them, beware, you don't want to get snared into eating meat sacrificed to idols. So the command is get rid of all the temples to the pagan gods in your country, Judea. And at the time of Christ, let's put it that way. Now, so it then says, you're to be worried lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants. So the fear, the concern of Yahweh is that people would make a covenant of getting along with the Gentiles, and they would go along with Gentile practices, particularly eating meat sacrificed to idols. And it says, and they play the harlot after their God. So they're doing something sinful, right? And sacrifice unto their gods. And one call you, and you eat of his sacrifice. So You cannot sit at his table and eat of his sacrifice. That's it. So you have to withdraw and not do that. So that's what Daniel is doing. That's what Exodus 34 verses 12 to 15 requires. And it's because it's a snare. It's a stumbling block. And Daniel 1 verse 8 says in the Israel Bible, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the king's food or the wine he drank. So he sought permission of the chief officer not to defile himself. Okay, basically, I don't want to have to eat this stuff on the table. And can I have different food completely? And that's apparently what is happening is he's doing it in his private room. And he does it for 10 days. And when he comes out, everybody sees the big difference between his healthy look versus all the other people who are there. And while many people suppose that the real reason that Peter was being dressed down is because he was saying, you can't eat with people who are uncircumcised, there's no evidence of that, okay? And there is no command in the law to not eat with Gentiles who have not been circumcised. What you are impliedly, by Exodus 34, not to do is eat with them when they are eating meat sacrificed to idols. Here is a book. Let me just show you this book. It's called Foreigners and Their Food. It's all about this. And chapter 4 goes into these Gentile items are prohibited, the foodstuffs of foreigners in early rabbinic literature. And here's the book. You can get it online. Here's the statement about what you could or could not do if the Gentiles are offering you food. These Gentiles items are prohibited. The foodstuffs of foreigners in early rabbinic literature. Judean literature from the Hellenistic era, by the way, this is page 47 of this book, reflects the existence of norms absent from earlier biblical texts. Jews ought not to share food with Gentiles, and they ought not to eat food prepared by such foreigners, especially if that preparation involved the worship of foreign deities. And I just want to say something to you. Does he not say something crazy here? Literature from Hellenistic era reflects the existence of norms absent from earlier biblical texts? No. It's right there in Exodus 34. But for some reason, he says that was new at some time later. And that's false. Clearly, you were not supposed to even go to their table and not eat with them. Okay, but he's saying that norm of not eating at their table was something that came later. They ought not to eat food prepared by such foreigners, especially if preparation involved the worship of foreign deities. And they actually should not share any food with Gentiles, meaning whatever they're eating, you don't eat, just to prohibit it. So why would you sit at a table and not be able to eat? Just go somewhere else like Daniel did and eat basically legumes or vegetables or whatever if you're in a pagan land where the markets are only selling meat sacrificed to idols. All right, so let's go to this book, Food by Mr. Friedenreich. And he's already said Jews ought not to share food with Gentiles, and they ought not eat food prepared by such foreigners, obviously because of the risk of eating meat sacrificed to idols. But if they obviously made vegetables or pulse, or that's beans and lentils, that would be different, right? Okay, especially if that preparation involved the worship of foreign deities. So he's completely correct. So that's when you refrain from eating with Gentiles. Page 97. For this reason, Paul sharply rebukes Cephas, elsewhere called Peter, for his behavior in Antioch. Cephas, Paul reports, commonly ate with Gentile Christ believers. And that makes perfect sense if they're just eating vegetables or salads or beans or lentils, right? But when, quote, certain people came from James, one of the leading apostles in Jerusalem, he was actually the bishop of Jerusalem, the brother to Jesus, according to even Paul in Galatians chapter 2. Cephas, quote, drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. I'm going to pause there. He's not saying for the fear that the circumcision faction requires people to be circumcised to be sitting at the dining table. No, it's just simply that's a shorthand term Paul uses just for people who he views as having the wrong doctrine about circumcision. But James and the apostles had no wrong view. They didn't require. The question in Acts 15 at the Jerusalem Council was, does the law require Gentiles to be circumcised in order to be a follower of Christ? The answer is no, because the only commandments to Gentiles to be circumcised are if they enter the temple, or if they want to participate in Passover, and also if they work in the house of a Jewish person. But that's it. So they didn't have to even address it. It's just like a non-issue. And so that's why when it says here circumcision party, it doesn't mean, or faction, it doesn't mean that's the issue. The issue is that's just a way of labeling James and them in a derogatory way by Paul, making them seem narrow-minded, even contrary to their own decision in Acts 15. But anyway, and the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy. That is, Peter and other Jews joined in hypocrisy, meaning not eating with the Gentiles, even if it was vegetables. That I can't I can't understand what Paul's thinking otherwise, because it's totally appropriate not to eat meat with Gentiles in the Gentile land, where the meat is going to be always mandatorily distributed from the temple where the sacrifices are done, and then you end up eating meat sacrificed to idols. And now Friedenreich is actually going to give you an idea. He doesn't pull it all the way out, but it's eating meat sacrificed to idols is the issue of commensality, eating together with people who are serving you meat sacrificed to idols. He says at page 97, rather, the issue at stake in Antioch is that Cephas has transgressed, that's Peter, has transgressed the Hellenistic Judean prohibition. No, it's a Bible foreign food restriction against commensality with Gentiles, attested in Jubilees and in the Septuagint's reference to heroes who abstained from, quote, the king's table, end of quote. Well, that's definitely in Daniel, right? But that was eating meat sacrificed to idols. So proving my point, that's what's the issue, that why Peter withdrew from eating with the Gentiles in the incident. And there was no hypocrisy, because if in prior instances, they were probably eating vegetables or pulse, that's lentils or beans. So why would he have to always avoid eating with Gentiles? No, he could eat with them if they were just eating salad or pulses, beans, and lentils, for example. In either case, this faction holds that Jewish Christ believers ought to adhere to, and he puts in the word Judean foreign food restrictions. No, Bible foreign food restrictions. That's what the whole message of Exodus 34 was about. You have to destroy their temple so that you do not get invited to someone's home and you end up eating their meat, and you end up unwittingly eating meat sacrificed to idols, and then that can contaminate you spiritually. That's what God is saying. If you don't believe it, that I can't help you. But if God says it, I believe it. Okay, and that's what Jesus also says, as we've demonstrated earlier in the book of Revelation, chapter 2, multiple times. Okay, let's start over. In either case, this faction holds that Jewish Christ believers ought to adhere to Bible foreign food restrictions. I'm correcting him, even with respect to Gentiles who share their belief in Christ. Cephas and those who follow his example seem to feel that they ought to observe these traditional restrictions as well, at least in the presence of those who came from James, and that's false. Again, there's no need to draw that conclusion. What you only know is that he withdrew in that instance, which would get you back to what did he say himself. You have this pattern where they are told withdraw or abstain from the king's table. That way you don't eat any of the meat sacrificed to idol in the book of Daniel, when he was eating meat sacrificed to idols himself, the king. But you don't want to do that, so you abstain from eating any food delivered at that table. So Friedenreich is actually looking at where Daniel refused to eat from the table of the king because of this very issue about eating meat sacrificed to idols. And Daniel 1, verse 8, we read, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. And then in 1:12, prove thy servant. So he asks the administrator, the food guy who's in charge, prove your servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. So they were going to go into a separate area where all they're going to eat is pulse or beans. That's the impression most people get if you research it. But it could have been they were delivered that food likewise at the table if they required it. But anyway, after 10 days, they looked really good. And that suggests they weren't there all 10 days. They were eating alone in the rooms, the three men, including Daniel. So what is a pulse? A pulse is a leguminous plants, for example, chickpeas, lentils, and beans. All right, so I want to discuss now what Peter was doing when he refused to eat meat, sit at the table and eat with the Gentiles. Obviously, he was concerned about eating meat, and that meat could have come from the pagan meat markets where everything is sacrificed to an idol before it's put on in the meat market. Okay, now where does Jesus stand on this? Okay, so it's going to be reflected here. I just want to read you the issue Peter had in the passage where he's dressed down by Paul in Galatians chapter 2, was table fellowship with those who eat meat sacrificed to idols. Revelation 2:20. And then listen to Jesus. Now Paul has been dead a couple of years. The book of Revelation is revealed to John the apostle, and we learn this. Notwithstanding, I, Jesus, have a few things against thee, because you suffer that woman Jezebel, which calls herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. Just don't do it. That's what Jesus was saying. But Paul's saying, nah, since an idol is nothing, the fact that the meat has been blessed by demons and false gods is no big deal either. But that's not true. Okay. I want to read you two instances in the book of Revelation where Jesus condemns eating meat sacrificed to idols. And I want you to notice that he calls it a scandalon. That's a snare. Okay, that's exactly what Exodus 34 calls it, but it's in Hebrew. Revelation 2:14. At Pergamum, some among you, Jesus speaking, hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block, a scandalon, before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols. I may have quoted that earlier, but I think it's worth bringing up again because the false reading is that Jesus means nothing. You just can ignore Jesus in the book of Revelation. If you take out one word of that book of Revelation, it says you will have your name will be struck from the book of life. How about that? Revelation 2:20, but I have this against you, that you suffer the woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and she teaches and seduces my servants to eat things sacrificed to idols. So it's very clear that Jesus is saying eating meat sacrificed to idols is a snare. He calls it that right here, snare, scandalon. Okay? I want to show you something that's going to startle you. This is Intervarsity Press, a very normative Christian Protestant group or organization. And he sees in Revelation 2:24 an anti-Paul remark by Jesus Christ himself, by Jesus taking Paul's words and showing how twisted Paul's words were. Let me read this to you. This is their message. Now, this is the link. If you ever want to go see it, just screenshot this and then screen capture the words. Jezebel may even have quoted Paul to the effect that God has revealed it to us by his Spirit, and the Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God, bate in Greek, bate, of God. 1 Corinthians 2, verse 10. Possibly, so he's not saying it definitively, but you have to use your own head. Possibly, with Paul's statement in view, the risen Jesus announces not just to Thyatira, but to all churches, quote, that I will repay each of you according to your deeds, adding that the deep things of such groups as this are not the profound truths of God, but the deep secrets of Satan himself. Verse 24. So if Paul is allowing you to eat meat sacrificed to idols, this is the message of Satan. Okay, I can't change Jesus' words, right? Can you? So Jesus is saying this is the message of Satan. If you tell people they can eat meat sacrificed to idols, which Paul clearly does, not only in 1 Corinthians 8, but also 1 Corinthians 10. This is the passage that Intervarsity Press says possibly is Jesus quoting Paul to make a derogatory statement about Paul's reasoning. 1 Corinthians 2, verse 10. Does Jesus in Revelation 2:24 quote from Paul's letter to mock him? Let's take a look. Quote, this is Paul's words. But we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, even the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the world unto our glory. 8. Which none of the princes of this world knew, for had they known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Verse 9. But as it is written, eye has not seen nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for them that love him. Verse 10. This is the verse. But God has revealed them unto us by his Spirit, for the Spirit searches all things, yea, the deep things of God. 1 Corinthians 2, verses 7 to 10. Now be aware, 1 Corinthians 8 and 1 Corinthians 10 are the specific two places, but Paul said it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. So it makes perfect sense that Jesus, when he's condemning it 2 years after Paul's death in 67 AD approximately, he is referring back to this when he says the deep things of Satan are the ones who tell you can eat meat sacrificed to idols, which definitely fits 1 Corinthians 8 and 10. I'm going to read to you from Ernest Rann in his work called History of Christianity, Volume 3, entitled St. Paul. He wrote this around 1871. This is from page 73. And so he sees Paul throughout the book of Revelation. He sees criticisms of Paul, but he ascribes it to hatred by the church. But later, Renan at page 326, he completely flips around. He says, you know what, now that I think about it, Paul is a hidden rock. But anyway, let's read what he said when he was totally defending Paul and accusing the apostles, including James, of being inspired by hatred. Quote, Paul from this moment was for a section of the church one of the most dangerous of heretics, a false apostle, Revelation 2:2. So again, what do you think is the message of Ambrose? What reference point is he looking at? He can see Revelation 2:2. A new Balaam, Revelation 2, verse 14. A Jezebel, his gospel was a false gospel. His visions, which he calls depths of God, 1 Corinthians 2, verse 10, they qualified as the depths of Satan, Revelation 2, verse 24. His churches they named the synagogues of Satan, Revelation 2:9 and 3:9. In spite of Paul, they proclaim boldly that the 12 are the foundation of the church of Christ. What he means there is the 12 apostles were considered the foundation of Christ, church. And there's no other 13th apostle, so that just automatically excludes Paul. So if Paul were valid, he would have said 13, but no, that's not what he said. And Paul's self-serving statement over and over again that he's an apostle to the Gentiles is never corroborated in the book of Acts or in the book of Revelation. Quite to the contrary. The 12 foundation stones of the church are the 12 apostles. Okay, I'm going to just leave it with this last slide, and then please look forward to episode 2. Hopefully it'll be out in a couple days. This is entitled The Revelation of Jesus Christ Closes the Apostles' Number at 12. This is in Matthew 19:28. His earthly ministry as well, Jesus said the role of the 12 apostles was to, quote, sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel, Matthew 19:28. Did anything change after the ascension of Christ? No. This is what he says in Revelation 21:14. Jesus does. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So Paul is excluded. I just want to show you something. Scholars who love Paul are upset with the fact that you read the book of Acts and it never confirms that Paul is an apostle of Jesus Christ. In Acts, Paul is denied the title of apostle. Hengel and Schwemmer, Paul between Damascus and Antioch, John Knox Press, 1997 and 321. Even a Paul defender, George Reber, accused Luke in Acts of trying to promote Peter at Paul's expense by denigrating whether Paul was an apostle. Quote, the first half of the Acts was written, as will be shown, expressly to exalt Peter over him and degrade him, Paul, from the rank of an apostle. George Reber, The Christ of Paul, 1876 at page 54. So these are things you normally are not even being told are going on, and yet they're important. The fact is that Luke never tells you that Paul is an apostle of Jesus Christ. That's the only person who does that is a self-serving statement of Paul. All right, when we come back, we'll show you some of the evidence what proves that Paul was a false apostle by virtue of just what I told you. The 12 are identified in the book of Revelation as the only apostles, and it by definition excludes Paul. Also, Jesus in Revelation chapter 2 says the Ephesians have done a good job in getting rid of the person who says they are an apostle but aren't, and they're telling lies that they are. And so you have a real problem if you're a Paul fan that you can see there's an overwhelming refutation of Paul's doctrines by Jesus Christ in Revelation chapter 2. Okay, in the next episode, we're going to tie in together Bray's edition of Galatians 2:11 of Ambrose's commentary, where in this point here, at one point, Ambrose says this problem that happened between them, this intervening negligence or error, this caused the apostles to fall out with each other or another. So there's where you have evidence of why you see what's going on in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2. So this is why we need to focus on this and see what is it we're not seeing normally when we read about this. But Ambrose is revealing it to us. That's what I'm saying. He's tying 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2 together with Galatians 2:11, and it'll be very interesting. All right, so look forward to seeing you next time. Ciao. Bye.